Hey, Neil. Go ahead.
All right. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It's really nice to be here today. I actually connected with Jean a little while ago, and he asked me to come and present at your user group. So I am very excited to be here. I do understand that this is more around data, this group. So what I'll try to do is talk a little bit, give some background on the Power Platform and kind of how it fits into data, into the data space, and then talk about the governance. And where possible, I will try to bring it back to talk about the fit with data. In terms of questions, so there's multiple sections I'm going to be going through. I'm going to quickly pause between sections. If you have any questions at the time, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue going through, and then Adriana will monitor the chat as you mentioned. And if there's any questions left at the end, we can cover them at that time. All right. So my name is Haniel Cretoro. As you mentioned, I'm an enterprise architect working for Protiviti. I'm a 5-time Microsoft MVP, working initially in SharePoint. Been doing a lot of work in Microsoft Teams, Power Platform, different areas. I've authored a book on Agile Office 365, which is around how do you implement Office 365 project using Agile methodologies and using Office 365 as a tool for Agile projects. So if you're in that space and you're interested to learn more about it, check out my book. I do a lot of speaking engagements around the world, particularly before COVID. I used to travel on a regular basis, something I really miss, and I'm hoping that very soon I'll be able to come visit you in New Jersey and present in person. I have 3 little daughters. I love them to death, and they kind of keep me honest and keep me true. So, all the time we spend on these events, they recognize it, they appreciate it. But it's really an opportunity to not just give to them, but to give back to the community. You'll see me blogging. One of the hashtags I typically use is flow in 60 seconds, which is more about automation. But in some cases, you will find stuff that is relating to data as well. Okay, so let's start talking about Power Automate or Power Platform and kind of the topic and why we're here today. So you hear a lot about automation today. It's a big buzzword. Companies are talking about it, consulting firms, everybody's like, yeah, let's automate and simplify. What's the big deal? Why do we even bother with it? So the first one is obvious. It tries to save us time. So anytime we could do something automatically using some tools, it's always going to be faster than if we're going to be doing it manually. So that's a kind of a given of why we automate things. The second one is reducing waste. So yes, we are in 2021, but there are still organizations that sometimes when you talk to them about, for example, initiating a vacation request form, an employee has to go to the intranet, they download a PDF, they have to fill it up by hand, scan it, send it to their boss, who then has to print it and sign it, and then send that over to HR. It's a very manual, very, very wasteful process that we can simplify. Reducing risk. So anytime you automate something, it's predictable. The results are more predictable. For example, if you're trying to send information to an individual, you may know two people with the same name, right? I may know 2 Adrianos. One I trust, one outside of the company that maybe I shared an email with years ago. Well, if I sent some confidential documents to the wrong individual, that information has left the company, it's out. So now I could have a potential lawsuit on my hand if it's confidential information that was leaked. So you're able to reduce risk essentially by automating some of the processes. Growing your business. So if you have individuals who are working on very manual, mundane tasks, those individuals can now focus on revenue generating tasks to really help grow the business, as opposed to doing the same task day by day. And it also would make them happier. And then the last reason is there is no other option. So for example, you have some data that is stored, for example, in a database or somewhere. You don't want to have your end users go directly to the database and extract all the information. For one, it would probably be difficult because most end users would not know how to deal with a database, but also there may be a lot of other data in there that you don't want them to see. So by using automation, you can set up a process where a user can request data and they only receive the information that they should have access to. So again, just a quick summary of why we talk about all this automation, which is a big component of the Power Platform. Now, the Power Platform is made up of 7 key components. We have Power BI, and this is really a front end to a lot of the data that you are working with to visualize and analyze and really make sense of what data we have. Power Automate for building forms and user interfaces for the users. Power Automate, which is your workflow engine, both for desktop as well as robotic process automation. You got your Power Virtual Agents. Those are your chatbots that you can stand up within minutes, literally, and load data into them and start using them. And then one layer underneath, we have our data connectors that allow our Power Platform to connect to different data sources, also SQL, DB2, anything pretty much in Azure, Salesforce. There's hundreds of these kind of connectors available today. We have AI Builder, which allows us to build additional logic so that we can further automate and simplify our processes, so that not only can we take a manual process and digitize it, but we can also make it predict the results and do further analysis to again save more time for the users. And then we have Dataverse, and Dataverse is essentially a database in the cloud that includes more logic in it. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. So Power Apps, as I mentioned, is a form building tool. You can build very rich interfaces that work on mobile, desktop, tablets, phones. You can integrate them into SharePoint. You can integrate them into Teams, into different systems. They are low-code solution. Actually, the whole Power Platform is a low-code platform, and a lot of it is very visual. You can almost think of it as a combination of an Excel where you can have all these related fields and data, and then you make it pretty with imagery and other types of controls to give it that kind of an experience. You have access to all these connectors I was talking about, and that allows you to really build that rich interface to interact with. Then we have the Common Data Service, which is now known as Dataverse. And this is, again, the database in the cloud. So rather than just starting with a plain, like for example, in the data space, you're going to start a new database and then you create your tables and you have to create your columns and your keys and all of that, that relational information. The Dataverse allows you to give you a building block where you're starting with well-known entities. So for example, if you're working with an account, there are a lot of fields that you would normally have to add, such as the organization name, the address, who's the key contact person, a lot of information like that. Dataverse gives it to you out of the box, these entities, and you can just build on top of those the additional information. Power Automate, again, this is the workhorse that does all the automation itself. You can build cloud workflows, which essentially interact with all these cloud services. And then they can also interact with on-premise data using something called an on-premise gateway. And then you also have the RPA bots, which allow you to mimic user interactions, and therefore reducing or eliminating manual steps for legacy systems. Power BI, you're probably all familiar with, is your visualization tool where you can connect to various data sources to understand and get more sense of your data. AI Builder, so there are different models available today that allow you to analyze the data you're dealing with and make more sense of it. So for example, you can do image analysis and say, okay, what am I looking at? For example, if you want to do order management, you may want to find a new component you need to purchase for a broken piece of machinery. You don't know what it's called. You can actually take a picture of it. And if that exists in the database for your company, it can actually say, oh yeah, you need this particular component. Let me go and actually order that for you through the order system. So a lot of automation and a lot of simplification that's being introduced here. The data connectors, so this is, it says over 350, it's probably over 500 connectors today that are available for the Power Platform that allow you to pull data from many systems. Again, it's not limited to Microsoft. There are many well-known services like Google and Salesforce and ServiceNow and others that you can connect with. And if for whatever reason you're working with some system that is not well-known or is legacy, you can build your own connectors as well. So really, there's almost no limit to what you can do when it comes to these connectors. Any questions about Power Platform, what it is and how it works?
Not so far.
Good. Okay, so let's start talking about governance. So when we talk about the governance of the Power Platform, there are 6 key areas that we're actually going to be looking at. So the first one is a governing body. So governance without the body is nothing. It's not enough to just have a set of policies and say, this is the governance. You actually need to have a governing body who's going to be creating, maintaining, reviewing, assessing all these kind of policies and how the environment is being used. Then we have licensing. So with everything in Microsoft and other services, there's always licensing involved. And you want to make sure that when you're assessing your environment, that you have just enough licenses available. You're not buying too many that are not being used, and you don't want to put yourself in a situation where licenses are missing and therefore your users are not able to work. Then we have security. So this is where we want to start looking at how do you actually build your solutions in the Power Platform to make sure that certain security standards are being respected and you're not inadvertently opening up your organization to some risks. Monitoring is looking at who's doing what in your Power Platform environment. Are they following the rules? Is something happening that you should be aware of? Alerting, so this is related to monitoring, where monitoring is something that you actively do. Alerting is happening passively. Behind the scene, as an event happens, you get notified. And then the last one we're going to quickly touch on is going to be application lifecycle management. All right, so the governing body. Typically, there's going to be 2 main groups. You're going to have your tactical group, and then you have your strategic group. The tactical group is broken down into 2 subgroups. You have your operational committee, and these are the individuals who are going to be essentially keeping the lights on, making sure that that everything is there. For example, people need licenses, determining who's got ownership of what, if there's any sort of servicing that needs to happen. That's what the operational committee does. So they're involved on an ongoing basis. And then you have your support committee. And this is going to be a team of individuals. Typically, this is like a service desk or help desk where they will receive requests, they will receive issues that they have to deal with. For example, if a workflow fails and they're being asked to look into it. Somebody's trying to access a part of the solution and they don't have access to it. So that's what the support committee does. And then you have your strategic committee. And this is going to be a combination of IT folks as well as business users who would then need to meet on a regular basis, review how is the Power Platform being used? Are there additional business needs that are not being addressed? Is the current governance meeting the needs of the organization, or do certain changes need to be introduced to then further match the needs? And so together, this is your ongoing Power Platform governance committee that you need to establish to make sure that all the rules are being followed and that the Power Platform is serving the needs for the organization. Now, when we start talking about the roles, so remember we talked about the operational committee, the tactical committee, so the support, they will need to have certain roles within the Power Platform, within Microsoft 365 to enable them to do their task. Global admin obviously gives you access to everything in Microsoft 365, including the Power Platform. It's typically not recommended to give many users global admin because that essentially gives them the key to the kingdom. They can do whatever they want. So you want to limit that. So one level down from that is the Power Platform admin. And any user who has that role can essentially do everything within the Power Platform, anywhere from creating environments, setting up certain tenant settings, assigning permissions, licensing, all of that. And then if you're working in Dynamics 365, then you can also use the Dynamics 365 service account. It gives you access to some of the features in the Power Platform, but not all of them. And then if you're working as a consultant helping an organization, you can be giving delegate admins, which essentially gives them the right to perform certain tasks in your environment. And so when you go to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center console, and you go under the roles for the users, you will see the different roles that are assigned, and then you can find out who are the users that have the specific role assigned to them. So in terms of recommendations, so first of all, you want to establish that body early on because you want to know who's going to be involved in defining these rules. Assign the Power Platform Service Admin role. to only the necessary individuals who are needing it. Better yet is if you can set up privilege identity management, PIM, so that that level is only given to certain individuals on a need basis, not all the time. Questions about the governance committee?
No.
Good. Okay. Licensing. So don't get scared. This is what the licensing model more or less looks like for the Power Platform. So at the bottom, we have our Microsoft 365 licenses. So essentially, if anybody here is using SharePoint or Teams or whatever, they're going to have a Microsoft 365 license. In many cases, it's going to be an E3 or an E5. If you're government, it's going to be a G license. If you're in academia, it's going to be an academic license, but that is the bare bones. Now, with those licenses, you can do some tasks in the Power Platform, but they are limited. So if you remember before I was talking about these connectors, there are some that are what I call standard, and then there are many of the other ones are premium. And so you can build workflows, you can build Power Apps that use the basic standard connectors without any additional licenses. So if you have anything in the orange tier at the bottom, you're good. The moment that you start building workflows that need to use premium connectors, for example, SQL is a good one. That's a premium connector. Once you start interacting with that, you now are moving into the premium tier. And this is where you have to start getting your licenses to meet your needs. So if you're building workflows, let's say that have to process data on a regular basis, you can use the Power Automate per user plan, which means that a user account can have as many workflows as they want, and they can run them. Or you can have a Power Automate per flow plan, and that allows running a single workflow for all users, but it depends on how many users, like a certain capacity. And then if you want to start adding RPA, then, and this is attended RPA, so robotic process automation, that's a different price point because now you're looking at a different part of functionality. And then similarly in the Power Apps world, so if you want to start building your Power Apps with premium connectors, there's a Power App per user plan and Power App per app plan. And then one tier higher than that is now if you want to start building your virtual agents, there's a cost for that. As well as the UI flows, which are for unattended RPA, essentially running on their own. And then building AI Builder is consumption-based. So for example, if you're building something that does image analysis or scanning text for sentiment or looking for a certain language, scanning business cards, all these kind of AI Builder models, they all have different consumption models to them. But typically they're about $500 per month per unit. Different number of units are being used for each one of those models. And then you've got your Power App portals. This comes from the Dynamics 365 world. It essentially allows you to build web pages that are surfaced to the outside of your company. They can be anonymous pages or they can be with logins. And so when you're looking at login capacity, for every 100 logins, it's $200. For every anonymous page, it's $100 for 100,000 page views a month. So that's what you can have, for example, if it's a some sort of a store that they want to have on the internet, they can have the anonymous pages, but then they can also have the login portal that they go into, and so it's a different pricing point. So you can see that the licensing model is quite complex for the Power Platform. Now, you are able to assign the licenses, so you purchase them through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and then you can assign them to the specific individuals. And then, as I said before, there's add-on capacity required for things like AI Builder, Dataverse. So that's the database essentially that stores all of your information if you're building the cloud databases. And so you need some capacity for that. For Power Apps, if you're running them a lot, sometimes you may hit certain API limits and you have to get more. For the portals, as I mentioned, depending if it's authenticated or anonymous, there's a cost, as well as if you want to add guest users. So if you want to have somebody who's not in your tenant, you want to give them access to Power Apps, they have to have an Azure B2B external collaboration license. All right. Now, something that's really important to note about the Power Platform licensing is by default, a user can go and purchase their own license in your tenant. So an employee can just go and register a license. So as an admin, you may think, okay, what's the big deal in that? It's not a problem. They're paying for it. But what might happen is they buy a license, which now they start to leverage for work, and they start building solutions that are being now used by other users, and they become mission critical. And then one day that employee turns around and says, oh, by the way, here's a $15,000 bill. I need you to pay that for me because there's this process that's running, and if you're not going to pay it, then everything's going to fall apart. So I always recommend to disable users from being able to purchase their own licenses within the company tenant. That's recommended. Otherwise, you may find yourself in hot water. So just to recap on the licensing, so they're expensive. So always review your licenses. Part of the governance team should review the licenses to make sure that you have just enough, not too many, not too few. Try to use trial licenses and trial development environments where possible. Just make sure that you don't have any client information there. And then disable your self-service license purchases. Again, that's just to make sure that users are not doing something that they should be doing. All right, let's talk security. So the Power Platform is broken into something called environments. So if you think about Microsoft 365, you have your tenant, and the tenant has different services. You have SharePoint, you have different types of services. In Azure, you have different types of subscriptions. So in the Power Platform, you have environments, and every environment is meant to be serving us a different purpose. So if you're building it for a certain business unit, you might have multiple environments for the same business unit, but one has development solutions that are in development or in QA or in production. And then also for the different business units, you are segregating those environments. They're broken down by location, and also you're able to control your access based on the different environments. So you don't want to have, for example, different users from different environments seeing the same data. This is particularly true when you're working in a consulting capacity and you have users in your company serving two clients that are competitors of each other. So you want to explicitly keep them separate from each other. Environment creation. So once you create an environment, you're tying it to a location. Once you've created an environment and a location, you cannot change that. So it's really important to make sure that you have the right environment, the right location chosen for the environment during the creation process. And all the data that is going to be stored in that environment is stored in that specific location. So when you're building a multilingual solution, you may have, for example, users in Europe, and they may have GDPR requirements or regulations. And so you create an environment for Europe and you assign the European users to that place. US, North America, South America, wherever the region might be. Now there's different types of environments available. Default is a default environment that is created whenever the tenant is stood up. All your users have access to it. You cannot change that. You cannot remove a user from the default environment. You cannot back it up. You cannot restore it. You cannot delete it. There's really not much you can do with the default environment. The one thing you can do and should do is rename it to something so it's clear to the users that they should not be using it for production development. That's not what it's intended for. Then we have production environments. They can be backed up. You have essentially full control over those. And that is what you should be using for your solutions that are used for productivity. Sandbox are used more for testing and sometimes development. And the idea behind them is that you can stand them up, you can reset them, which essentially deletes everything in there and gives you a fresh start. And the good thing is also is once you have a sandbox environment, if let's say you've done testing and everything is good, you can actually flip it over to a production environment. So you don't have to go through a whole migration process. You just say, okay, sandbox is now becoming production. Trial environments, those are good for just short-term testing. So they're there for about 30 days. A single user can use them. And that allows you to do, for example, if you want to do a quick proof of concept or something and you don't want to use extra licenses and extra costs, you could stand up a trial environment to allow you to do that. Development environments, those are actually tied to your corporate account, but every employee can have a developer environment where they can start building their own solutions and experimenting, but they cannot share, they cannot add other users to that environment. It's only them. And the last one, which is something you cannot manually create, it gets created automatically, are Dataverse for Teams. So in Teams, you can actually go and you can start creating solutions, apps and workflows and all that, and Dataverse. When you do that from Teams, it actually goes behind the scene and it provisions what is called a Dataverse for Teams environment where you can store your data and all of that data gets collected. But again, you don't have a lot of access to modify the settings. It's all done through Teams for you. So few guidelines, change the default name to be something like personal productivity so the users understand that it's not intended to be used for production. You should establish a process for requesting environments. So turn off the ability for users to go and purchase their own or set up their own environments. You should have a process where users can go and request it, whether through an automated process, a form, some other form, but it has to be something that has to be well planned because there's costs associated, there's security associated with that. So make sure that that's in place. Again, carefully select the geographic region because once you set it, you can't undo that. And then as much as possible, try to leverage your trial environments, development environments, just so that you're not incurring extra costs for the company. Restricting the new trials. So this is something you can also do so that not everybody can go and create trials on the same accounts. It's going to be only the admins. Some more considerations. And this is not specific to the Power Platform, but the Power Platform can benefit from it. One of them is called the least privileged access. So really what you're trying to do here is make sure that users can only access the minimum amount of data they need. So if I build a workflow that will access a SQL database to get data, rather than giving my account access to get all the data, maybe what I want to do is set it up so that I have a view, or maybe I have some stored procedures and I say, okay, I run the procedure and I just get the minimum amount of data that I need to do my process. Network access control. So you can limit where certain pages can be visited from. So for example, while you're logged into your tenant, you can say that the login page for Power Automate can only be accessed from the network. So if you're not inside of the building, you can't go and run any workflows. And then we have location-based conditional access. So you may want to say only certain devices or based on other criteria, certain individuals can only run certain workflows or run the service as a whole. Data loss prevention is another area that has to do with security. So I talked about these 500 plus connectors, which are great to use, but you got to use them very carefully. Imagine that you've got your business data, which is, SharePoint and again, SQL and all of that information. That is your core company IP. And then you have other connectors like your Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and whatsoever. What you don't want to happen is somebody's going to build a workflow that says, every time you get some sensitive information, go and tweet about it or send a message on Facebook. Like that would be a huge gap, or even email it to a personal account so they have a backup of that. So the Power Platform has data loss prevention policies you can implement that basically say that anytime you build a workflow or every time you build a Power App that mixes what is called business data and non-business data, it's going to block you from using it. So a workflow will automatically be suspended from running, and a Power App will not allow you to be published if it breaks one of the DLP policies. And these DLP policies can be added to specific environments. They don't have to be global. So you might allow marketing have a DLP policy where they can post to Twitter, they can post to LinkedIn, because that's part of their job, is to promote the company. But then others cannot do that. So for example, in a default environment, you want to introduce data loss prevention policies to minimize the connectors that are available. Now, once you start introducing the data loss prevention policies, you have to keep in mind that there may already be workflows and Power Apps that are in use today. So you got to be careful, because you can actually implement a policy and break a whole bunch of workflows immediately as soon as it's rolled out. So there's something called the Power Platform Center of Excellence, which is a tool that Microsoft has built, and you can implement it in your environment. It allows you to do a lot of things, and one of the things it does is it shows you which policy impacts which workflows and Power Apps. And so you can actually go reach out to the owners and address these things. And for the Power Apps, the policies are only addressed once you go and republish the app. When you're just making a change without republishing, it doesn't do anything. So this is kind of this slide kind of summarizes the whole idea behind the access to the data sources and the connectors. And so really what you want to do is you have your citizen developers on the bottom left. They should have access to the minimum amount of connectors and the minimum amount of data. So they may be working with only OneDrive, their email, maybe the SharePoint sites they have access to, and that's it. As you start going up into the second tier, now you start talking about privileged citizen developers that have access to additional connectors. So this is the marketing department who can now also use, let's say, Twitter or some of the other connectors, or there may be other business reasons that users in that category can write to the other services or use other services. On the bottom right, we have citizen developers that may still have the limited amount of connectors, but have access to more of the data. So for example, rather than being limited to one SharePoint site, the users in this group may have access to all the SharePoint sites. So maybe you have some sort of a data analytics team within the company, and they need to be able to access more of the data than the average user. And then in the top right, this is essentially your application development or platform support team. They have access to all the connectors. They have access to all the data. Another thing about security. So when you build workflows, there are different types of what I call triggers. So the trigger is something that starts a workflow. A trigger can be time-based. A trigger can be immediate. So essentially you have like a button on a phone or a physical button you press. Or it can be triggered based on a certain event. Sending an HTTP request is a type of a trigger. And the way that the Power Automate workflows are built today, there is nothing that stops a user who has a URL from calling that URL. And if that kicks off a workflow, guess what? That person has just kicked off the workflow. Now, depending on the type of trigger it is, if it's a post event, a delete event, does it need any input, you could potentially restrict who has access to it. So for example, you can have like a token or some sort of a secret that you're putting right into the call that you're making, and the workflow will check for a match. And if it doesn't find the match, it doesn't run. Something else you can do, which is better, is use something called Azure API management. And this is where you can register specific APIs with Azure API management, and only certain accounts or certain domains are allowed to execute these workflows. So if somebody tries to call this API for the workflow, Azure API management will check it out and say, hold on a second, this individual is from outside the company, it's not going to run. Sharing workflows. So there is nothing that prevents you from sharing your Power Apps and your workflows with people in your organization. If you want to share them externally, again, the users must have Azure B2B external collaboration. So you can share them But what you can see here is that this specific user is going to have connections to Office 365 groups and Outlook and SharePoint, potentially other things, but it does not grant them the actual access to SharePoint. So it's really important to remember that sharing a workflow or an app is not enough. You actually need to grant the users access to the data sources as well. And then on-premise gateway. So I mentioned before that in addition to the hundreds of services online that users can interact with in their workflows and the Power Apps, there are also on-site or on-premise environments, DB2 servers, SAP, many other like file servers and other types of data sources that you might want to interact with. And the on-premise data gateway is what allows you to do that. It essentially acts as a tunnel where you would be connecting to those services, and the tunnel does essentially the proxying for you. Now, service accounts. So recommended practice or best practice is to never have anything that is mission critical running under a user's account, whether it's a Power App, whether it is a workflow or a virtual agent or a gateway, anything like that. And the reason is because if that person, for whatever reason, is locked out or has left the company or that account is deleted, you've effectively killed that process. It's not going to run anymore. And so what you should do is have at least one service account that you're using for your apps and services, but better to have different ones for groups of apps and services or based on business units. And that allows you to then run your environment more effectively. You want to set up a long password that does not expire, right? So there's studies that now show that having a complex password is better than having passwords that expire all the time. Because again, when the password expires, everything that is attached to that account is now blocked. And also, if possible, disable multi-factor authentication on these service accounts, because if they need to re-authenticate periodically, again, it's not going to work unless somebody is monitoring those service accounts and providing that authentication. So lots of information around security. For data loss prevention, right? So what you want to be doing is have the minimum amount of access to any sort of data connection, data points, mixing of business data with non-business data. And then make sure that all connections require authorization. And this is essentially what I was talking about for the HTTP trigger. Make sure that that you have privilege to services that are when using the apps. And then on a regular basis, there are new connectors that are being made available. So there's actual workflows that you can run that tell you, here are the new connectors that have been released by Microsoft or by third-party apps that are now available in your environment. You can't block them from the environment, but you can be aware. And then once you're made aware of them, then you would actually go and review them and then decide, do we need to add them into any of the existing data loss prevention policies or potentially add some new ones. And then we talked about having service accounts to manage the apps and services and stop users from adding their own gateways. All right, moving on to monitoring. So when you're talking about monitoring the Power Platform, there are many ways to do it. There are, so you've got the Power Platform Admin Center, and this is specifically on the Power Platform. You've got your Microsoft 365 Admin Center for dealing with licenses and user accounts and roles. Azure Monitoring Application Insights for managing, finding out where are people connecting from and what kind of devices are being used. Security and Compliance Center, that allows you to monitor usage. So there's something called the Unified Audit Log, and you can find out what type of actions have been performed. Power Virtual Agent Admin Center for looking at the usage, and the Power Platform Center of Excellence, as I mentioned, that's an add-on to your environment that just gives you some good analytics of the overall usage of the Power Platform. So I'm just going to kind of really quickly go through them. So you can see like the number of active users on Common Data Services, the old name for Dataverse. I forgot to change that. But you can see the kind of entities that are being used, where they're being accessed from, the entities that are most popular, jobs that are used, any plugins to Dataverse, API calls that are being made. So all the information is available inside of the Power Platform Center of Excellence. You can also turn on auditing on CRUD events, and you can actually get very, very granular. You can go down to specific fields. The only thing you want to be careful is that the more that you audit, your audit logs are going to fill up more, and you may have to purchase more for audit logging. Power apps. So this is, we can see the usage of the apps that are being used, where they're being called from. Are there any sort of errors? Service performance, right? So is there any degradation, any slowdown? The actual app usage. So how long they're being used for, how many unique users, and then the connectors that are being used. And looking at those analytics, that can give you sometimes an indication of, okay, well, what are people actually doing in the Power Platform just by looking at this information? For Power Automate, you can get some really good analytics on the workflow runs. For specific runs, how many failures, the type of failures, who's creating new workflows, any sort of errors, how are workflows being shared, or who they're shared with, and then the connectors being used again. And then for capacity, I said before that if you start doing a lot of logging, that's going to chew up your capacity. But there's actual 3 types of capacities when it comes to the Dataverse. So you've got your actual data that you're storing inside of the Dataverse. So think about the tables in your SQL database. So that takes up capacity. The second type of capacity is file storage. So you can store files within your Dataverse model. That also has its own capacity. And the third one is the logging. And so when you're purchasing capacity for the Power Platform for Dataverse, you buy the 3 different types of capacities, and you're just going to make sure you have enough, because otherwise things start to fail. And you can see right here in light blue, this shows you your database capacity. In the dark blue, you can see the file capacity, and then in orange, the log capacity. So this particular tenant, they're doing very little logging, and they're storing very few documents inside of Dataverse. But then most of the actual data that they're using, or most of the storage, is for the data itself. And then you can look at it by environment. So I mentioned before that Dataverse is associated with an environment. So every environment, you can look at how much storage it's using up. What are the add-ons in terms of capacity? So are you buying extra, and how much? And this is good if you want to do some sort of a chargeback model to the departments and say, okay, I'm going to charge every department based on their usage. This is where you can get those analytics. And then you can also get information about Microsoft Teams usage. Azure Monitor Application Insights. So as I mentioned before, this is where you can find out about the number of users and sessions, what kind of browsers are being used, what kind of operating systems are being used, where are people coming in from. So this is information that's available inside of the Azure Monitoring Application Insights. The Security Center. So what I mentioned is there is a unified audit log, and there are literally hundreds of events that are getting stored on a regular basis. And there's a few events specifically to the Power Platform that are stored inside. So for example, if somebody goes and creates a flow or edits it or shares it with somebody else, same for Power Apps. So you can find out when are these type of events happening. And this is really good, because what you want to do is you might want to have a situation where somebody shares a workflow, you want to know about it, because maybe it shouldn't be shared, especially if it's in a default environment. These logs can be exported into your security information and event management system, because they're only stored for, I believe, 30 days or 60 days. And then if you want to keep them for a longer period of time, you want to have your own backups. Power Virtual Agents, again, this is for just getting analytics about what are your chatbots being used for, how successful are they. It doesn't necessarily tell you about errors, but it does help you build a better service over time. And then the Power Platform Center of Excellence, there's a lot of information built into it, mostly based on workflows, Power Apps, and Power BI dashboards, just to help show you the health of your environment, what's being used, how is it being used, and really help you govern your environment as well. And then for service health, there's actually insights you can get to submit tickets and to find out where, if there's any outages or any issues to deal with. And then you can submit your own tickets. There's actually a very, very detailed, almost like a wizard, to really help drill down and make sure that you capture all the information. All right, so for monitoring, so enable Dataverse entity auditing. Just make sure that you're not going too granular. And then on a regular cadence, you want to review the environments you've created, how much capacity is left, who are the admins, and what kind of privileges are assigned. Do you need additional licenses based on who the users are going to be? And then enable your security center audit logging so that you can find out what's happening if you need to, and if somebody did something, and then if you need to export on a regular basis to your SIEM. If anybody's interested in the Power Platform Center of Excellence, there's a link here that you can look at to download it. It does take a few steps to get it to work, but once you have it working, it's pretty good. Okay. So again, monitoring is about actively going and checking out what's happening. Alerting is more about the system telling you and notifying you of something. And there's different ways to do alerting. One of them is using PowerShell. So there's a PowerShell module, which is the Power Apps. Actually, there's a Power Apps module and the Power Apps admin module, and they allow you to find out, to do a lot of analytics around finding out if somebody has created anything, modified anything, actually go and deploy, assign permissions. So a lot of these tasks you can perform directly inside inside PowerShell, and that allows you to do a lot of the configuration. So imagine you can have some sort of a timer job that says, okay, on a regular basis, check for licenses or see if there's anything that has changed and notify. There's also connectors available in the Power Platform that you can build a workflow so that if something happens, the Power Platform can actually help manage the Power Platform, which is kind of funny. So one of the common examples is sharing. So again, if you're building a personal app for yourself and you say, I'm gonna share with the rest of the company, and that shouldn't be done because it hasn't been vetted by IT, you can actually build a workflow that will monitor or that will be triggered based on a webhook and say, oh yeah, hold on a second, somebody did something that shouldn't have been done, find out what the flow is, remove the additional users from that flow, and then send a nasty email to the employee saying, hey, hold on a second, you shouldn't have done that. And so you can really leverage PowerShell and the connectors to perform these type of tasks. So again, leverage PowerShell and Power Platform for its own management. The last section I want to touch on is application lifecycle management. So a couple of things is try to, when possible, build some sort of templates for your workflows or your apps if you're going to be building them, or if users are going to build them, just to implement some best practices for your organization. So building in some sort of try catch, finally block, error handling is always a good idea. It's not something that's available out of the box. So you want to make sure that those templates are available, and you want to probably have them hosted somewhere on a site that users can go to and leverage as needed. Now, when we start talking about environments, as I mentioned, there are 6 environments in total. I'm not talking about the trial or the Teams one, but of the 4 regular ones, when you're talking about development of an actual solution on the Power Platform, the approach you typically want to take is every developer on the team is going to have their own development environment, and they're all building their own piece of the solution. Once they're finished building their part, they're going to be essentially pushing their solution to a sandbox. And this is a place where the testers will have access to, the developers will have access to, and they can test out the solution initially. If everything is good, then you go to the next step. If not, you go back to development, they fix it, and redeploy that to the sandbox. Then you can have a second sandbox, and this would be for your business users to go to, and they can verify that the solution is meeting the business needs. So not just technical, but the business needs, that everything is good. And this is where your UAT testers have access. And then finally, once everything is done, either you take the sandbox and you flip it into production, or you create another environment for production. And this is where all the business users have read access, or they use access to the environment for that specific solution. So that's kind of the typical application lifecycle management cycle that you want to have for developing solutions in the Power Platform. This could be a single flow, or it could be a whole solution with multiple workflows and apps and dashboards, etc. And now specifically around solutions, when we talk about them, they're essentially a packaging of your workflows, your apps, your dashboards, other types of information, data. You can have multiple solutions within an environment, but then every solution itself is treated as a package. And so the package begins with some system entities and information that is provided whenever you stand up the new solution.
Hi, we cannot hear you.
I'm sorry. I think I've hit the mute button by mistake. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Let me backtrack. So solution.
When you start talking about the system solution.
Yes. So let me go back here. So the system, so whenever you're going to have multiple solutions in a single environment, every solution will be essentially a collection of workflows, apps, and other components. When you create a system solution, you're going to get certain elements, some environment variables and some other components that are created by Microsoft. And then you start building your customizations on top of it. So you're going to have a managed solution, which basically means that when you give that to a user or to a client, they cannot make modifications to it. And that's on purpose, because it's only the developers who should be making changes to it. It's like giving somebody source code. You don't want to do that. You want to give them the compiled solution. And so the development team, they're going to be making any sort of changes to it. They're going to continuously do patching. And then eventually, once all the patches have been added, you can then roll it up to the next major version. And then once that's being given to the business, they can then decide if they want to add on top of the managed solution another layer that is unmanaged. So they can't touch any of the managed components, but they can then add their own changes or make additional modifications without disrupting what has been built so far. So again, this follows a very similar paradigm to other type of development frameworks. That brings me, I believe, to, so just to summarize the application lifecycle management. So follow organizational standards. You want to deploy managed solutions, not unmanaged. Leverage development environments, single purpose. So basically, once you have an environment figured out, stood up, use it for one solution. Don't start mixing, because that's sometimes you get in trouble for that, where one solution impacts another. And then what you want to have is allow your development environments essentially to be disposed and recreated. So you're working on a project, you check in all of your changes, you can then recycle your development environment to start fresh, and then work on something else. Using source control is always a good idea, especially when you start having multiple people work together. You can do what is called continuous integration and continuous deployment, where as users are checking in their changes, everything gets deployed to that sandbox I was talking about before, and then that sandbox always has the latest changes in it. And then there's something called Solution Packager that allows you to manage information in your solution to make sure that all dependencies have been taken care of and there's no issues. That's pretty much it. So I'm going to open it up to questions now.
All right, folks. Remember, enter your question on the chat window here. We are looking for questions. I see David. He is saying helpful related information. You may want to touch on, hang on a second. Fine-grained controls, such as the ability to block specific connectors, connector actions, or connection endpoints are new as well. And then he also mentioned about virtual networks and data gateways. Connect data services secured Azure VNet without the need of on-premise data gateway. Yeah, do you have any, as we are talking about here, best practice and all, information on, I saw you talk about Dataverse.
Right.
Haniel, and any pointers if as we are sharing that data with the Azure. You know, I'm talking about like if I'm in Synapse and I want to access and or integrate the data in Synapse and or Databricks to come into Dataverse. I know there is a connector there.
Yeah, there is a connector. You can integrate them. In terms of governance specifically, I think the similar rules would apply in terms of security, right? Making sure that you're limiting who has access and the type of access that the accounts are going to have. I think those are really the main points. It's a lot of it is going to happen behind the scenes. It's not going to be a user necessarily who's going to be directly interacting with the Synapse or the backend on the Dataverse. So this is where you're going to have that kind of some sort of an integration happening with it between the two. So you want to have an account set up that's just to limit that access. That's always a good idea to minimize it.
All right, and it is also my understanding that with that connection, that setup will allow for example, for data that being entered on, for example, Power Apps to be captured and accessed from whether it's Synapse and or other service to bring into Azure if one wants to.
Yeah, Power Apps can definitely interface with a lot of these different services. So it's a matter of whether it's directly from a Power App or through some sort of a workflow or third-party means. You can use the Power App as your front end for capturing data or displaying data that exists in these other services. Absolutely.
Outstanding. All right, that's great info there for sharing. And folks, remember, if you have a question, feel free to use the chat window here to enter your questions.
While people are writing questions, I've also put my contact information on the screen. So if you have any other questions you want to connect with me or follow up afterwards, please feel free to reach out. My blog is a bit dated, so I actually have to update that, but definitely by email, LinkedIn, Twitter, you can always reach me.
All right. All right, and there's also a suggestion, not a suggestion, another pointed there from David talking about RMS workflow, included on COE. All right, folks. Haven't seen any more questions here, and if no one has any question at this point, but it may come up at a later point, check out Haniel's contact information right now, draw it down, and